Hello, I'm going to talk today about my labour and birth with my third baby, my third and most recent baby. I have written about this before on my blog, which I'll put the link to below in the description box, but this is the first time I've done a video on how his birth went. I did a nice video ages ago where it was like a set to music kind of welcome to the world video, but this is the nitty-gritty of his birth. He is 2 now and it's taken a long time for me to talk about this birth. Whilst it's not the worst birth story, it's also not my most positive birth story, so I've kind of wrestled with the conflicts between wanting to be positive for other people. I know there's a lot of people who look for videos on birth experiences when you're about to do it yourself, so I don't want to scare people, make people feel anxious, but then the other side of that I wrestle with is wanting to tell my true experience. The other thing that makes me not want to talk about this birth experience is that I'm going to mention birth trauma. I have that thing where I feel like maybe my trauma isn't that valid. People will be like, but nothing bad happened, you know, he was fine, he had a healthy baby, you didn't have any major intervention or surgery. So it kind of feels a bit strange sometimes for me to talk about birth trauma, but as you'll find out later on in this video, there was a lot of stuff that happened psychologically that really affected me. This video is an induction story and it is also a story about having obstetric cholestasis. I've had 3 rather different labours. I've done videos on both of those, which you will find in the description box that I've linked to. This birth was so different to what I'd experienced with my older 2 children. It just goes to show, third time round, you don't know everything. You can have a completely different experience, completely different birth. Anyway, that's enough rambling at the beginning. Let's get on with the actual birth story. Throughout my pregnancy with Otto, or at least in the 2nd and 3rd trimester, I had been a little bit itchy, and I talked to my midwife about it, but we were in the middle of a big house renovation. It was quite dusty and I do suffer with a bit of eczema and skin irritation, so I just thought maybe it might be that. We weren't sure. It didn't seem serious enough to look into, and my midwife said if it increases, or especially if you get a lot of itchiness on your palms and the soles of your feet, to let her know. So cut to 35 weeks, late 35 weeks, almost 36, and the itching suddenly increased and it was on my palms and the soles of my feet. So I had a midwife appointment that day, I think, or the day after. I mentioned it, she took a blood test there and then the next day she called, and I knew already it was going to be obstetric cholestasis. At this point, there's kind of no ignoring it. It's not like, oh, I'm a bit itchy. It's like, no, this is something I haven't experienced before, this is a problem. So I knew they were going to say what it was, but what I didn't quite know was like what happens when you're diagnosed with it in late pregnancy. So I got a call the next day from my midwife saying that I needed to go into the antenatal unit at the hospital and discuss my test results, because there had been an abnormal result, which I was expecting. So my mum was here at the time, just visiting, so I said, right, I'm just going to pop to the hospital while you're here. You can stay here and look after Arlo and Rory, and Sam will be home shortly anyway, so I'll just go now while you're here. So I literally trotted off to the hospital just with my handbag and my notes, nothing else. Just thought that they were going to go and discuss a plan, maybe take another blood test. I don't know what I thought, just sauntered off there with nothing, and then got to the hospital and was promptly told that I wouldn't be leaving and that I had to stay here until the baby was out, and they were going to induce me as soon as possible. By my ovulation dates, which were completely right because we were trying to conceive this baby and I know exactly when I ovulated, I was 35 weeks plus 6, so the next day I was going to be 36 weeks, but by my scan dates they had put me a week ahead. So they said, well, seeing as you're 36 plus 6, you'll be 37 tomorrow, that's when we induce when people have obstetric cholestasis. You'll stay in overnight and then tomorrow we'll induce you. So I literally have gone from sauntering in for a mundane checkup sort of thing, that's what I thought I was going for, to you're having this baby tomorrow, and to me that's 4 weeks early. I hadn't packed my bag, I had to write lists for Sam there and then. My mum obviously had to stay longer, the kids had to go and stay with grandparents, we had to arrange all of that. I was literally not prepared at all. It was so silly in hindsight. I should have packed a bag earlier, but I suppose having 2 older children who'd both come within a day or 2 of their due date, I just was not expecting to be told that I was gonna have a baby 4 weeks before 40 weeks. This is the point I started to get the first waves of anxiety, because of course in my head I knew I was 36 weeks, whereas the hospital thought I was 37, which is full term. And I did try and tell them, but they went by my scan dates. But I was anxious. I was anxious to have a baby come that early. And I was anxious that my body was definitely not ready to go into labour, and that they were going to try and put me into labour. So it was all just a little bit scary at that point. But I had no choice to roll with it. I wasn't allowed to go home. So this was it. This was happening. Because I'd had 2 straightforward vaginal births before, they just thought there's no point in trying with the gels and pessaries, we'll just go straight to the breaking of the waters. Problem was, it was a massively busy time period on the labour ward. It was like May bank holiday, I don't know if that makes a difference, but it was the May bank holiday weekend, and they were just so full, there was no room. So even though I had this high priority induction situation going on, there was also this slight kind of hypocritical sense of your situation's urgent, we do need to get your baby out really soon because obstetric cholestasis can lead to stillbirth and all that scary stuff, but also we're actually too busy, so we can't prioritise you right now. So that's kind of a weird situation to be in. It was quite stressful and sort of infuriating. What I didn't know at this stage was that it was going to be 6 days before I would finally get on to labour ward. Because I was stuck on the antenatal ward and labour ward was full, they then came back and decided that they would start me with the gels and the pessaries that you have to induce labour. I'm not going to go into this bit loads. I've written about it on my blog. There's blog posts. I will link them below if you want to read all about that stage, but it's all fairly boring. The only thing I will say is that it was just a right pain in the arse to sit on antenatal ward for 6 days, feeling like every day this is going to be it, gearing myself up only to be told, no, it's not going to be it. You're still stuck here for another day. It's not happening today. And I was surrounded by women in the early stages of labour, and in some cases in the later stages of labour, and they weren't being moved because labour ward was so busy. So I was hearing all the time people in labour, knowing that that was going to be me at some point shortly, and that was quite kind of daunting at first. And then towards the end, like after I'd sat there for a number of days listening to people in labour progressing much faster than I was and having their babies and leaving the hospital during the time I was still on that ward, I was just like, right, I just want to be there now. I want to be at that stage. So it kind of psyched me up towards the end. But it was a really tricky time. It was so hard to stay positive in that environment, not really knowing what was going to happen with me, feeling like I was totally out of control of all of the decisions. The consultants would come round once a day and they'd chat with the midwives, and it's all very kind of like, they don't consult you, they just examine you, decide what the course of action is, and then just tell you the next thing that's going to happen. There's no kind of time for niceties or the subtleties of language. I think just even, I would have just appreciated them saying like, we would like to do this next, is that okay with you? Or, you know, there was no kind of permission asked, there was no sort of consent. It was just, this is what's happening to you. And I felt completely like out of control, like none of this was my decision. I was just kind of at the mercy of like how much space there was on the ward and whatever the consultant that day thought they should do with me. So I didn't like that much at all, and I was in a pretty bad mood for the whole time I was on the antenatal ward. I had a pretty bad attitude, and in hindsight it's easy to say that I wish I had shook that attitude off, and I probably would have It probably would have helped me when I eventually got to the stage of labour, but I mean, I think it just would have been impossible to do in that environment for me, to be honest. There were countless times on that antenatal ward where I was hearing women in the bays next to me who were in pretty established labour, like, you know, you can just tell, and I just felt so sorry for them. A lot of them were probably first timers and had no idea, and you know, and it's hard to advocate for yourself. And at one point someone actually gave birth in the hallway outside, and this was the point when labour ward was completely full and the hospital was just clearly overstretched. But yeah, that's kind of not a nice thing to have like going on in the background when you're preparing for your own labour. It's very much like a conveyor belt. You feel kind of like cattle. And for someone who had been planning a nice peaceful home birth in my own surroundings, it was all just a big kick in the teeth. So after 6 long days, labour ward finally had space for me. So I got taken to my room. It was finally the day that I was most likely going to meet my baby, and I was scheduled to have my waters artificially ruptured at around 10 AM that morning. I remember being led to the room that I was going to give birth in, and I really don't like hospitals, and I walked into the room and it was very small, very low ceilings. I felt instantly claustrophobic, instantly more afraid. I said earlier, the whole time I'd had quite a bad attitude. I was convinced that I was just on a slippery slope of intervention and I was going to end up having a C-section and everything that wasn't in my birth plan. I was just convinced. I was like, right, that's it. That's what happens when you have one intervention, it leads to more. You always hear about it, and I was just convinced that that was the path I was on now. And because I had absolutely no control or say in the situation, I might as well give up now. I was in a really, really bad space at this point. The midwife was in the room. She was very busy with her notes. She kind of barely looked up to say hello to us. I instantly felt that she wasn't very warm, and that made me worry more. I was kind of hinging all my hopes on having a midwife who came in and immediately put me at ease at this stage, because I was so kind of already just down on myself and convinced that everything was not going to go the way I wanted it to. So the whole 6 days I was on the antenatal ward, I was constantly told by every midwife that I saw that once I got to labour ward I would be able to move around, even though I did need constant monitoring because of the obstetric cholestasis situation. And I was so worried that that would mean I couldn't be mobile. And with my previous labours, I know that I need to be standing, I need to be moving around, I don't need to be flat on a bed, and I'd find that really, really hard to cope with. So it was a big worry of mine that because I had to be monitored, that would limit my movement. But I was reassured the whole way along that there was even one monitor that would work in the water. So if the room with the pool was free, I would actually get to have a water birth, which to me was exactly what I wanted. So there was that small glimmer of hope. And then as soon as I got onto the labour ward, that glimmer of hope was extinguished pretty quickly when they announced that the waterproof monitor wasn't working, so the pool idea was completely out. Otto is trying to nap, but actually he's just crying, and it's probably going to be a nap fail today. So failing that waterproof monitor, I still wouldn't have to be strapped to the bed. I would still be able to kneel by the bed or stand by it, and the monitor would just be attached by kind of like a metre-long wire, so I'd still have some movement. I'm mentioning this now because I'm going to come back to it in a little bit, so just wait for that bit. So it was time to break my waters, which I was really, really quite scared about. I don't know why. I think I thought it would suddenly mean that labour would kick in and it would be really intense, and I just hadn't had it happen that way before. My waters had always broken quite late in the latter stages of labour with my elder 2 sons, so this was a completely new experience for me and I just didn't know what to expect. At some point during my time on the antenatal ward, I think I'd been given a leaflet about having an artificial rupture of membranes, which is breaking your waters deliberately, and the risks involved, and one of those was cord prolapse, where the cord comes out first, and that can be quite dangerous, I think, and needs action straight away. When my midwife went to break my waters and kept her hand inside and pulled the emergency alarm button, I knew what that meant, that there'd been a cord prolapse, or at least she thought there had been a cord prolapse. So the senior midwife came in and she said, no, it's fine. So my midwife removed her hand, and I could see on her face how like scared she was, and obviously that completely made me scared. And that's the first time in any of my labours that I've ever felt scared. I think maybe in hindsight I was really lucky to have 2 labours before this one where I felt assured. I mean, you know, I was in pain, it was annoying, it was like a marathon, it went on for so long, but I never at any point felt scared, or that I wasn't in the best hands, or that something might happen to me or my baby. This was the first time I'd ever felt that, and it is a horrible feeling. And this is part of what I mean when I say that I experienced birth trauma. Is this was just one of a couple of psychological things that I experienced which have really had a long-lasting effect. Now that we knew that everything was fine and I hadn't had a cord prolapse and it was just your average rupture of membranes, I was allowed to get off the bed and go walk around and just get on with it. My contractions did start straight away, but they were pretty gentle at this stage, and this was the only point in this labour where I felt really calm, confident, in control. I was like, right, this is happening now. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. I can cope with these contractions. And I was just in the zone, and I thought maybe I've cracked it. Maybe third time round I have totally got a handle on this, and I'm not going to be shouty. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be that person that just like really calmly like breathes their baby out and has a really nice experience, and yeah, come on, let's do this. I was really positive, and unfortunately that was the only time that I felt positive during the whole experience. And then everything from this point on starts to happen really quickly, and the labour switches gear literally in an instant. A lot of stuff happened during a short space of time. A lot of it is quite quick and blurry to me, but there were quite a few events, so I will talk about them now. One that I remember is being back in the room. Labour's really kicked into gear and is established now, and I've got the monitor on, and somewhere in this the midwife cannot locate the heartbeat, which happens a lot. Sometimes, you know, the monitor slips to a different position and they just readjust it and there's the heartbeat again. Happens quite regularly, nothing out of the ordinary, except this time she was trying to find it for quite a while. It's one of those things where it's probably not that long at all in real time, but to you every single second feels like a lifetime. It was a horrible, horrible moment. I remember looking at Sam and the midwife's trying to find the heartbeat, and it's just that feeling. And then she still couldn't find it, so she got really bossy at this stage, and you know it's serious, and she told me, you need to get on the bed, you need to lie still, I can't find the heartbeat. Obviously I'm losing it at this stage, and eventually, I'll put you out of your misery, they did find the heartbeat, and I think she just wasn't looking in the right place. Maybe the baby had changed position, but it felt like a really scary thing to be put through after all of that. And I remember at this stage just completely losing it, breaking down in tears. I felt so vulnerable, so out of control, so fearful for my baby, and I just said, I can't do this. I need the baby to be out now. I need the baby to be safe. If it's going to be like this, I need to have a C-section. Please just take me to surgery. It's not, I can't take this emotional kind of turmoil and the ups ups and downs anymore. It was so just too much. And as I said earlier, the midwife wasn't the sort that could kind of reassure me in the way I needed. She was so kind of cold and like down to business, and I just felt like me and Sam were completely alone in this, and it started to feel really, really scary. So I was in an increasing amount of pain, and I was just pleading. I'd had enough. This had been a 6-day ordeal, a 6-day journey to get to this stage. A lot of worry in that time, because obstetric cholestasis comes with its own stresses and worry about the safety of your baby. I've been monitored so much over the last 6 days. I was just in quite a fragile state of mind at that stage, so I was pleading with everyone just to end it now, just to give me my baby safely, just to make sure that he was okay. Coincidentally, my home birth midwife happened to be on the ward at this point in the day. Because this whole thing happened so quickly, she couldn't be with me for the birth. She had other appointments and other women that she was dealing with that day, so she couldn't be my main midwife. But she had popped into the ward at that point, and she came in to see me, and that was like, oh, it's so funny that you can still feel like so raw about these emotions and the fear, like over 2 years later. It's crazy. So she came in to see me. She kind of knew how vulnerable I was. She knew that this wasn't what I'd wanted at all, that it was so important to me to be at home in an environment that I trusted. She knew that I'd been on the ward for 6 days and it hadn't been an easy journey. And I could just see in her face that, you know, she felt for me, and that this isn't what she would have chosen for me either. Seeing her, who was the midwife I'd had for all of my antenatal appointments, it did kind of reassure me, reground me, like, you know, I knew this person, I was familiar with her, she knew me. She also kind of added weight to my theory that I maybe shouldn't be scared, and it probably was my midwife on labour ward who was contributing to the fear more than what was actually happening. Because every time my main midwife left the room, my home birth midwife would readjust the monitor and like to a better position, and we'd hear a louder heartbeat. And I think maybe the midwife I had just either wasn't very confident or wasn't very experienced. And I don't know how to put this, like, I don't blame her, but definitely how she acted made such a huge difference to how supported and sort of fearful I felt during this birth experience. So because of the whole heartbeat issue with my main midwife not being able to find it, and I think maybe that had affected her a bit as well, so she from that point on insisted that I had to be on the bed, I had to be strapped to the monitor flat on the bed, and I had to stay as still as I could, which was really, really difficult for me. I just find that position so hard when you're in established labour. It's so much more painful, and my instinct is just to get up, to get on all fours, or to stand up. It's such a strong instinct, it's really hard to fight. So I was in more of a position where I felt out of control, where I felt like I had no choices, and I started to feel really, really unhappy, and any shred of kind of motivation that I'd had to get through it, I just let go of at that stage. And I just knew I couldn't cope, or I made the choice not to cope anymore. And the pain started to get incredibly bad at this point. Things had just ramped up so quickly with all the gels and pessaries that I'd had in the days leading up to this, and then breaking my waters. The pain, the contractions had just ramped up so fast that I hadn't had a chance to get used to it, and I just lost it. I was that screaming, raving woman that you see on TV shows. It was like not even real life. It was like an out-of-body experience. I kind of had to remove myself from my body to cope with that situation, and I kind of was vaguely aware of myself as this raving woman, like looking at myself from above. Just literally, if you'd have asked me my name, if you'd have said, are you a human, I just would not. I'm like, who am I, what am I? All I know is this pain. It was such an overwhelming feeling of pain. and I was scared. I didn't know how to come back from that. It's like once you lose it, you really lose it, and it's really hard to regain control and some sort of sense over the situation. So I was screaming for an epidural. I kind of figured that this might end in C-section anyway, and I kind of wanted it to, obviously, at this stage, because I was scared for my baby. So I said, right, give me an epidural. I need an epidural. Can't cope with this. I don't remember ever being calm from that point on. I was probably one of those people that you hear screaming down the hall and that all the midwives just look at each other and roll their eyes at. I was that lady. At one point during this, I was allowed to take a trip to the toilet, which was like, oh, just the relief of being able to stand up. But then on the way back, I keeled over. I just got really hot and faint and a bit dizzy and kind of just needed to lie down. And the midwife got really anxious and worried again. And Sam and I were kind of like, you know what? She does this a lot. Like fainting is kind of like my thing. I haven't had it happen in labour before, but I have felt faint before in labour. And it didn't feel like something out of the ordinary. So we were like, look, please, it's fine. Don't worry. This is just something she does. What I now realise in hindsight, after what happened after this point, is that this was transition, and it was just quite a fierce transition, and that's why I came over faint. The transitions in my other labours have all been really slow and natural, and I didn't even really notice transition, and actually it was quite a nice stage with those labours, but this was one of those ones where it switches a gear, and I just didn't realise at the time that that's what was happening. So I'm back on the prison of the bed, and I'm examined, and I'm 5 centimetres. So I'm in established labour now, which is great, but still quite a while to go. I'm still screaming for my epidural. I'm still not happy about lying down. But the reality was that I was just experiencing severe overstimulation from all the gels and all the pessaries that I'd had, and the breaking of my waters, and it just kind of hit me all at once, and it was too hard to handle. So I'm conscious at this point that my midwife is telling me that I'm bleeding quite a lot, but I'm still feeling quite out of body at this point. So although I'm listening to her, I'm not really taking it in. The anaesthetist and his team arrive, and then suddenly I get that unmistakable urge to push. If you have been in labour before, you will know what I mean. You just cannot stop it. Except I'm only 5 centimetres. This is literally probably about 10 minutes after I was last examined, and it's only been about an hour since my contractions first began, so no one's expecting this, and I know I'm not ready to give birth to this baby.
And that's your camera.
That is my camera. I'm talking to my camera about when you came out of my tummy. So I'm told not to push because I'm not ready. I'm only 5 centimetres, and that is such a hard thing not to do. It's like your body, you can't not push. Your body just pushes involuntarily. So to fight against that is like fighting against an unstoppable instinct. I attempted to entertain their idea of trying not to push for probably approximately 1 contraction or 2, and then I decided I just had to push. It was just ridiculous to try not to. It wasn't even possible. So I apologised and said, I'm sorry, but I have to push. How ridiculous is that? I actually apologise, like had to apologise. The anaesthetist team have arrived at some time during this point, so they're standing in the doorway. There's about 3 of them. So I push, and immediately, to my surprise, I feel a head crowning. So automatically I switch to, oh, I am actually ready to push. He is ready to come out, and this is happening now. I'm still losing a lot of blood. The midwife has pulled the emergency alarm again. There's a crash team running through the door. So Otto arrives into the world really quickly, really hectically, after about half an hour of established labour, to an audience of about 10 people, a scene of chaos, blood all over the floor, and the sound of the alarms going. It was a proper dramatic entrance. Went from not being in labour, no contractions whatsoever, to being fully dilated within an hour. It's called a precipitate labour, where you progress super quickly. And it's not something I was prepared for at all. My other labours were reasonably long, 17 hours of active labour with my first and 12 with my second. So an hour-long labour was not at all what I had anticipated, and I'm pretty convinced that it happened because of all the pre-prep that I'd had in the form of the gels, the pessaries, breaking my waters. It all just overstimulated me and led to a really quick labour. Although it was my shortest labour by far, it was incredibly hard to cope with that pain. And out of all of my labours, it's the one that I would least like to go through again. I would much rather have a long, slow labour that steadily progresses at a rate that your body can handle than one that happens super quickly that you just can't handle. So everything was fine after that. Otto was fine, I was weak, but I was fine. They wanted me to stay, but I could not wait to leave that hospital. I'd been there for 6 days at this point, and I was just like, I'm going as soon as I can. So we left straight from the labour ward and went straight home. I just remember feeling so relieved that it was done. At one point, when they were failing to induce me, it literally felt like this baby was never gonna come out. It's been a long journey processing this birth. I'm still not done processing it, to be honest. I think it will, maybe I never fully will, because I just felt so not in control of so many aspects. Last thing I want to do is make someone feel scared, and that's kind of why I was so hesitant to make this video, because I know that it's not the best story out there in terms of induction. But on the other hand, I do also think it's important, if you are about to go through the induction process, to have an idea of how it can feel, how it can work. There were a lot of things I could have done maybe to advocate for myself better, to make sure I felt like I had more choices than I did. If you're watching this and you are about to have an induction, the most important takeaway for me was just to never forget that you do always have a choice, even though it feels like all the decisions are being made for you, and it feels like a lot of your choices you initially had on your birth plan are being taken away. The ultimate decision is still up to you, and if there's anything you do not feel comfortable about, you have the right to talk it through, to not let people just easily make the decisions for you without any regard about how you're feeling. You have the right to feel worried, to feel anxious, and just try and stay as positive as you can. There are a lot of really positive induction stories out there, and I would do it again. I would just maybe ask for the epidural before they break my waters next time. If any of this has resonated with you, if you had a similar birth, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you're about to go through induction, leave me a comment. If you have any tips for dealing with birth trauma or aspects of your birth that you weren't happy with, or if you've had one of those debriefs with your hospital, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear about experiences of that and how you went about it. The links to my other videos about my birth stories with my other children are in the description box, as well as the links to the blog post about Otto's obstetric cholestasis induction story. That is a really hard phrase to say correctly. Thank you for watching. Bye.